I've heard you talk elsewhere about a housing price correction. Were you talking in the 1 to 4 unit space? And how do you think that could happen?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't come up with that idea. I did a biography of my good friend Stan Middleman, who's the founder of Freedom Mortgage. It's a real rags to riches story of a successful entrepreneur. A great guy, by the way. He's a beloved man in the mortgage industry. And so what he believes is that cycles are about a decade in terms of human behavior. And he says misery on the eights, which is kind of a cute way of saying it. And what Stan is basically saying is you eventually see so much price appreciation that affordability goes to zero. You run out of buyers, is another way to put it. And then once the Fed gooses it, he thinks we see an interest rate decline this year, next year perhaps. You get rates to run a little bit, you get volumes to jump the way they did last summer. You remember in the third quarter, we had great volumes in the mortgage industry, carried everybody through to the end of the year. And then after that, he says we get a price correction, maybe back down to 2020, 21 levels. So we're talking about a 20% price correction, and we're talking about the loans that have been made in the last few years being underwater. Okay, that's something we haven't talked about in a long time. We haven't talked about that since 2008. So I think that Americans inevitably have to see some kind of a correction. What the Fed did was wrong. What they did was excessive. I write about that in the end of my book. But unfortunately, the result is home prices that have galloped along, and eventually you got to reset it. Part of it's supply coming online. Part of it is simply, like I say, you run out of buyers. And when it's simply that purchase buyer who is either all cash or happens to have the deposit, and that's all you have, and there's no flexibility for people that want to get into the market, it's tough.
In my opinion, I don't see how there could be any substantial residential home price correction. Historically, that happens when there's a wide swath of homeowners that get into financial trouble. Like I was talking about earlier, the homeowner is in great financial shape today. In fact, since World War II, we've only seen home prices drop substantially during one period. That was that period around 2008, and that's when we had conditions that are opposite of what they are today. We had loans underwritten with liar loans, and we had an oversupply of homes. Inflation can't touch one's principal and interest payment. We're still undersupplied with homes. Most experts don't think we'll get that into balance for at least 5 years. I really don't see how home prices could fall substantially. I also don't see how they could rise substantially, like say 10%, due to that low affordability, but I expect continued stability in prices.
Well, we'll see. I'm not as sanguine about that because a lot of people feel house rich on paper, but when the bottom of the stack is really hurting, as it is now, FHA delinquency rates really are in probably the mid-teens. You don't see that yet in the middle with the 720, 740 FICO type borrowers. But I think over time you could. And again, it depends on the economy and some other factors. But I'll tell you right now, you're already seeing a correction in the high end. The bottom half, no. And there's a supply problem here, which I agree with you on. It's going to keep those home prices pretty firm. And even where I am in New York, for God's sake, Keith, there's no construction here. So we just
Right.
had a house across the street from me go for $1,000,001. I live in Sleepy Hollow, New York. And, this is typically around the conforming limit for prices for most of these homes. And it went for $150,000 over the ask. It was crazy. It went in 2 weeks. Now, during COVID, we saw this sort of behavior, and we thought, well, okay, you had zero interest rates. I got a 3% mortgage, by the way.
Awesome.
But here we have a situation when markets cooled down a lot, and yet the lack of availability is really the driver. So in that sense, I agree with you, but I do think the high end could correct rather substantially.
You can watch this one next.